Good morning, U.S. history. How are we? As usual, guys, I hope you're well, and I hope your family and you are healthy and safe. This next message is to YouTube. I will be uploading this to YouTube. This video is for educational purposes. There will be offensive material probably because we're dealing with race relations around the turn of the century, including sensitive images. It's educational material for a college prep class. These students will be receiving college level credit for this class. Please consider that. Now, to my class, I will tell you this. We had our last video removed. I'm assuming it was because of that. Hopefully it wasn't because of something. Hello?
The last video was actually removed from YouTube?
Yes, it was. A class video about civil rights was removed from YouTube. So hang on just a moment. Yes, George, it was. And unfortunately, if you remember the way that we started our lecture on Monday, it started with a video whose initial image was a lynching. I don't know if you remember that or not. It was really grotesque. And it's a very mature image. And it's just unfortunate that that's the screenshot that froze on the descriptor for the video. So I'm assuming that's what it was. It just some type of algorithm that picked up that particular image. I appealed it, so maybe they will. Other than that, I don't think that there was anything that would have been deemed inappropriate unless they don't like me saying that I love you and I'm praying for you kind of thing, but then get over that. But anyway, let's continue. We are...
List the video as unlisted and it won't take it down.
Do what now?
You can list the video as unlisted on YouTube and only we can see it and it won't take it down.
So how do I lock that into that?
I think when you're posting the video, you can see if you want it to be public or unlisted. That's what my math teacher does.
So how do I?
So only we can see it?
Yes. Help a...
So when you're posting the video, when you're posting the video to YouTube, there should be a thing where you want it either public or unlisted.
Right. I'm aware of that particular one, but once I click unlisted, how does that give you access to it?
So you would post the link on Canvas so only we could access it.
Got it. So I can shift that video to an unlisted one.
Yeah.
I'll work on that later this evening. Thank you for that, and I will utilize that idea. Teamwork makes the dream work, doesn't it? Okay, so let's continue on. We're discussing civil rights around the World War I era and the summer that followed, which unfortunately in American history is known as Red Summer, even though it coincides with the exact time period of the fear of communism, commonly called the Red Scare. In reality, it is in relation to the bloody summer that followed the troops' return from World War I. And as they were returning, and as America was adjusting to a new norm in the North and Midwest, and continued struggle against Jim Crow in the South. Excuse me, not COVID, dust. Let's call it that. Now, let's continue. We had finished the Chicago race riot, and we were well on our way with the Knoxville race riot, I believe. Yeah. So again, this is all in the course of one summer. A deputy sheriff was arrested. Now, let that sink in for a moment. He was what at that time was called a mulatto, which means of mixed origin or of mixed race at the time. And Bertie Lindsay had been murdered, a farm wife in an area, and obviously, I mean, I don't mean to minimize and I don't mean to trivialize a happening, but at that era of time in the South, when something tragic happened, oftentimes rather than just investigating the circumstances, they would look for, unfortunately, the closest male color of or person of color to the situation, and that's oftentimes who would get the blame. He was arrested. A mob shows up. They move him out of the area. A mob shows up, and a lot of white prisoners escaped, by the way. 36 people wound up being killed in this melee. He was not released to the mob, but he was convicted and executed. But to this day, a lot of people believe he was actually innocent. There was circumstantial evidence against him, but other than that, there was no actual solid evidence. That's the Knoxville race riot. The Omaha race riot. Now, this is one of the more amazing stories in U.S. history. Now, yes, it's tragic, but the circumstances surrounding it are they're so Hollywood. And you'll see what I'm saying. Omaha, Nebraska. Now, you may not think of Omaha, Nebraska as a center of Black culture, okay? Omaha? But in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Omaha was rapidly growing. It was largely because of the meat processing industry that existed there. To this day, Omaha is known for that. It's also known for logistics and trucking industries and insurance and agricultural-based headquarters of corporations. And anyway, because there were so many industrial jobs and stockyard jobs, et cetera, coming available, it became a destination for citizens who were, escaping conditions in the South and headed to trying to find a brighter future. And largely in Omaha, African Americans were treated for the time with general respect, and there obviously there were, as in any other cities, there were specific neighborhoods for specific, unfortunately, for specific ethnic groups, etc. So ghettos were there, but in Omaha, African Americans were largely treated well. There was no segregation, etc. But in 1919. By the time we get to 1919, should I say, there were large numbers of African Americans in Omaha. And a 19-year-old white woman had claimed, now I'm not trying to minimize any woman's claim for anything ever, I'm not saying that, but she claimed she'd been raped and due to unfortunate circumstances, 40-year-old African American Will Brown was arrested for rape. Now, whether or not it happened and whether or not it was actually Will Brown is questionable, okay? She did identify him in a lineup as the man who had raped her. And so a large group of white young men gathered trying to lynch him the day he was arrested, which brought the press out. And you also remember that from 1880 through the 1920s, newspapers on the eve of radio had become the primary mass medium. And so there was a lot of competition for sales. We've talked about this ad nauseum. And so, sensationalism was still around. So yeah, they printed a ton of sensationalistic reports about African Americans committing crimes against white women. And that begins to really stir up the local population. Follow? And so naturally, being 1919, and white young men predisposed to believing what they believed in 1919, this fed into a very dangerous atmosphere. So it all began when a group of young white men met at a school, and they began to march towards the courthouse where he was held. Now, the head of the detective bureau met them, and one person in front of a large number of people saying, look, we're not doing this. We're not doing this mob rule thing. You need to just disband and head home. But they ignored him, and they continued, and more people joined. And when they got to the actual courthouse, the station, at 4 o'clock, there were 30 officers outside guarding the station. And so a standoff begins, and the crowd gets larger and larger and larger, and then begins to yell things, and then begins to throw small things. But the captain in charge, the duty officer in charge, said, this is Omaha. Nothing's going to happen. And he had 50 reserve officers at his, call there that he could have held on to. And he sent them home for the day because he said, they're not going to do anything. It's Omaha. Well, by the time we get to 5 o'clock, 4,000 people were outside the courthouse. And that's when they begin to get really aggressive. Mob mentality takes over. They begin to attack the police. Police turn water hoses on the crowd. I mean, they tried. And when that happened, the mob of people began to actually hit the police and throw sticks and bricks and anything else, rocks they could find. And so the police had to quarantine inside the ground level of the courthouse to defend the courthouse. And then the mob rushes in, and so they have to go back up into the stairwells and go up a level, and they begin to actually shoot their guns down the elevator shaft and down a corridor of stairs, not aiming at someone, but just to continually shoot down so that they don't try to come up. They're trying to scare off the rioters. They're not trying to actually kill anyone. That's dramatic, isn't it? I mean, that's some dramatic stuff happening there. And then the chief of police tries to actually speak to the crowd. There's your picture of the mob outside the courthouse. He tries to speak with them, tell them that justice will prevail. They would not listen to him. They yelled down a bullhorn. He gave up, and by 6 o'clock, they had lost control, man. They had absolutely lost control. Any policeman who came outside. See, what you have to keep in mind is though Omaha is a city, it had humble roots, right? So a lot of these families had been around for a while and may have known each other. So you had, intermixed with all this chaos, you had families coming in and trying to stop their cousins or the people they went to church with. Like, what are you doing? Why are you here? Trying to pull them away. And then the crowd gets so angry and incensed, they begin to randomly attack black people who were still in the area because it was Omaha and nobody expected anything to happen. And then you had white people trying to protect the black people who were being attacked. And then the crowd would attack them. And in the meantime, any police who came out trying to address any of the issue would be attacked and their weapons taken from them. Bizarre situation, as you can imagine. By 7 o'clock, the crowd had taken over all the way up to the 4th floor. The police had retreated to the 4th floor. And at this point, it becomes a mission for the sheriff to protect Brown at all costs. By 8 o'clock, the crowd was completely out of control. It had taken over local businesses, hardware stores, gas stations, etc. Had gotten a ton of gas, poured it on the bottom floor, and set fire to the courthouse. Wow. These are men, deputies who are serving on higher floors that they go to church with. These are men that they know. These are their neighbors, and they've lit the building on fire. Stores were looted. 1,000 firearms were stolen from businesses that were attached. So you can imagine now police officers who's gotten in the way of the mob were shot. 7 officers were shot, wounded. 2 members of the mob also were killed. So this is getting extremely serious. Obviously, it had been serious for hours, but that's how fast this disintegrated. From 4 to 8 o'clock, now you have literally a town being taken over and shots being fired and a courthouse being burned because a mob wanted a man delivered to them for justice rather than court system serving justice. The fire kept going. I'm telling you, this is a dramatic story. It sounds, like I said, it sounds like a movie. The mayor came out, and keep in mind, this is the mayor of Omaha who came up during the height of the stockyards. He was a stockyard guy. He was one of those guys that you either hated or loved. And it was getting close to an election, and there were a lot of people who spoke out against him. And so one of his political opponents, supposedly, I don't know, I wasn't there. But anyway, a man in the crowd yells out when he tries to speak to them that he has a gun. Oh, he shot me. I know that's bizarre. And then a crowd of people rush the mayor. But this is no normal mayor. This is like a Chuck Norris type of guy. Not literally, all right? He begins to fight off multiple people. And he's having this brawl with this large crowd until finally somebody cracks him in the head from behind with a baseball bat. And then they put a noose around his head, and he's kind of out of it, and he's yelling, "If you have to hang somebody, hang me. Let it be me." This happened, guys. This is U.S. history. And then one of the women who is desperately trying to get people to break everything up and all rushed and covered him and tried to get the rope around his from around his neck. The crowd that rushes her, more people try to protect her, and then people are fighting over this, and a lot of men actually manage in the chaos to drag him away from the scene and throw him in the back of a police car. But it didn't matter. The crowd surrounded the car and flipped it and drug him out. Got a noose, threw it around a traffic signal, and whoosh, yank it up. At this point, enough time had passed that Nebraska state agent Ben Denham had driven into Omaha and made it there, and had just literally gotten there when he sees them literally pulling up the mayor on the rope, and the mayor's hanging there. And in Hollywood fashion, he drives his car and slams it in the base of the traffic tower and knocks it over. And he collapses. He's taken to the hospital, nearly died from his injuries, vocal cords permanently struggled, and he releases a public statement that says, "They shall not get him. Mob rule will not prevail in Omaha." Now, why is that not a movie, right? But it's not over, unfortunately, tragically. By this time, the fire had begun to spread. Police officers tried to appease the crowd. They demanded that he be delivered to them. At this point, you have men and women prisoners together, and they're being brought to the roof. The women prisoners, white and black, were eventually allowed to leave the roof, and they were escorted through the burning building, allowed to leave for their own safety. And then, once the women were free, the mob built the fire higher, as you can imagine. Now, if you're a prisoner on top of the building and you're facing death or the release of this one prisoner, probably what's going to be your self-preservation choice? Turn him over, right? Yeah. And that's what happened. They began to send messages to the crowd, and then they give confusing signals, trying to confuse the crowd. The judge says, "I'll give him up. He's in the dungeon. There are 100 white prisoners here. Save them first, blah, 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 blah." And then eventually come to the fourth floor and we'll hand him to you. So now you have deputies on top of a burning building with fireman ladders being placed up against the building, trying to push away, trying to push people from getting up on the roof, and fighting to defend this prisoner from other prisoners on the roof. And in the chaos, obviously, you probably already realized Will Brown was captured. And then, of course, the unfortunate thing happens. His body was hanging from a telephone pole until he was dead. He was then cut down. The corpse was tied behind an automobile, and you can see the rest, dragged through the streets, and then they poured oil on him and burned him. After it was burned, they dragged him again. It's one of the most public, horrific, violent examples of 20th century lynching that we have. The rioters continued on for hours and hours. 3 times the crowd tried to burn the courthouse to the ground. But by this point, soldiers, now keep in mind, soldiers in 1919 would be less inclined to be as forgiving as soldiers today. These are World War I soldiers, and the infantry is deployed to Omaha, and you can see photographs there. And Major General Leonard Wood was not to be trifled with. This is the man after whom Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri is named. He shows up with 1,600 soldiers. He imposes martial law. He shuts down Omaha, and he cracks down, and the riot is over. And his body, Mr. Brown's body, was buried in Omaha's Potter's Field in October. Okay. Wow. Now, curious, who all's heard of that story before? No one? Yeah. It's very difficult to comprehend something happening like that, isn't it? But guys, this happened in a city that had the reputation of actually being accommodating to migrating Southern African American population. So you can imagine in other areas of the country how negative and how tense situations were getting towards African Americans. It was a very dangerous time. Okay. And in the overall cultural realm, you had this generation of African Americans who had been raised post Reconstruction, who were educated and who were fighting back against inequality. You had poor Southern African Americans, and by that I mean poverty poor, in the South, who were stuck in the cycle of debt and poverty known as sharecropping, but also now no political voice whatsoever. You had competition for jobs across the South, sharecropping positions at Southern with poor white Southerners, and in inner cities with immigrant populations. And now you have returning veterans expecting their positions back. And you have large numbers of African Americans moving to places like Omaha and Chicago and New York and Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, etc., for industrial positions. So you now have this mishmash of conflict. And it's a very violent time. Okay. The Elaine race riot. How many's heard of the Elaine race riot in Elaine, Arkansas? Okay. If I were to ask you guys, and I want your opinion, where was the largest ethnic slaughter in U.S. history? Most of you would probably say what?
That Indian one, like Wounded Knee or something.
Well, a lot of people would say either Wounded Knee or Sand Creek Massacre, probably, right? Both horrible atrocities committed against Native American populations. And you're aware of those? We've covered those. Does everybody remember those? There's actually an ethnic massacre in Arkansas that only in recent years in scholarship, by recent, I mean the past few decades, because in particular of a particular book that was written by a scholar, I believe from Memphis, but I'm unsure of that, on the Elaine race riot, that uncovers some new scholarship on how many deaths there actually were, and it's horrific. Okay, so let's take a look at that, or not. There we go. This is a horrible situation. By the way, it's one of the things that propelled the NAACP into prominence, which in 1919 was a young organization. Obviously, you've already studied the formation of the NAACP. The riot started, remember the rise of unions that we discussed in late Gilded Age, early Progressive era? Well, this extended to a degree in the agricultural community. There were unions that were trying to represent sharecroppers and to protect the price of the crops that they raised, and to provide more rights for sharecroppers. And there were some unions that were aimed specifically at Black sharecroppers. Well, as you can imagine, populations in an area, in any given area in the South, would have resisted that significantly. So a group of Black sharecroppers meet in a church in Elaine, Arkansas, to discuss plans for joining the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. They were considering filing lawsuits against their landlords. So this is perfectly just business related, normal activity, right? Well, the union representatives, this was not their first hoorah into this sort of thing. They knew there would be issues, they knew there would be trouble, so they send some security. They hire some security for the meeting, and they hire a former deputy, sheriff's deputy, and a former railroad detective. We've discussed railroad detectives in the past, right? This was not an individual to be trifled with, and so they were hired for the security. Well, as you can imagine, when word gets out, a group of white men associated with landowners in the area surround the church, and violence erupts. They begin to fire into the church, except this crowd was ready, okay? And they were armed as well. But they killed the railroad detective. They wounded the deputy sheriff. Now, at this point, the leaders of the church are calling for an investigation, calling for intervention, but the situation outside the church just gets worse as more and more white people begin to show up from neighboring counties. These are counties, keep in mind, where the black population outnumbered the white population. And so word spread of a, quote, black uprising in Elaine, Arkansas. And so people just poured into the area, and fighting, and by fighting, I mean gunfire, like battling broke out between whites and blacks for about 3 days. And newspapers in the area, this is Arkansas, all right, Deep South, 1919, Jim Crow South. So you can imagine the types of things that they were printing. They were making these outlandish claims saying that this is the beginning of an insurrection, which prompted more and more white men to show up in the Elaine area. The Arkansas governor warned of a, quote, Negro uprising, unquote, there. And he actually requested that the U.S. War Department send troops. And the troops show up under the understanding and perspective that the governor had given them, and they exchange fire with the African-American farmers. What happens is essentially for a number of days, you have white armed men roaming Elaine, Arkansas, looking and hunting. And I use that term specifically, hunting black people. There are stories now that have come out, and especially thanks to the book that was written about this, where entire families, hid in cotton fields for 2 and 3 days on end, on their belly, laying down in the center of acres and acres of cotton, so that no one, as just crowds of white people would go down the roads and shooting randomly. That is a horrific situation. Originally, it was estimated that 100 to 200 African Americans were killed in Elaine, Arkansas. Now, if you look at a map and you look at the demographics of Elaine, Arkansas, you'll see it's not a highly populated region. But this particular researcher, should I say, speculates that upwards of 500 African Americans were killed. Now, guys, it doesn't matter for the purpose of the lecture whether it was 100 or 500. Either are tragic, okay? And that's a huge amount of men and women and children, by the way, who were slaughtered unnecessarily. And that needs to be remembered, and it needs to be remembered more in U.S. history than it is. We remember Wounded Knee, we remember Sand Creek, but no one in America remembers Elaine, Arkansas, and I don't know why that is. And that's just right around the corner from us, guys. You could make it to Elaine and do something there and make it back on a day trip, okay? So guess who's arrested? You got it. 285 black men. Guess how many white men were arrested? You got it. None. It's what comes out of the Elaine riots that we remember in history, okay? And we're going to cover the consequences of the Elaine race riot when next we meet on Monday, okay? Because time has snuck up on us. Remember, as soon as we finish this discussion of race rights, we're going to schedule our progressive era test, which I am anticipating will be 1 week from Monday, which should put it 11th, 18th, on the 18th of May. All right. So as usual, we will hold off. I'll stop the recording, and we will hold off on questions until, we'll hold off on personal, like questions related to your grade, etc., until after we've stopped the recording. If you have any questions about the content itself, please go ahead and ask. Are there any questions about any material or any due dates or anything coming up? Okay. Now, if you have other questions that you don't want answered in front of the class, or you don't want to ask in front of the class, please hang on. And after I stop the recording, I'll happily address that in a more intimate fashion after everyone logs off. So If there are no questions, guys, as always, I love you and I'm praying for you. And stay safe. Stay safe. God bless you and your family. And we will see you on Monday. I'll be here Friday for questions, as always. So if you have further questions, please hang on. I'll be stopping the recording now. Have a great day.